By way of introduction for everybody else, I'm Debbie Wheelan. I'm Deputy Head of the School of Architecture and the Built Environment at the University of Lincoln. I've been involved in the heritage sector for about 25 years, so I will bring a very different slant and perhaps quite an unexpected slant to what is, I suppose, undoubtedly quite a lot of very European focuses on heritage. If I can possibly introduce to you Stephen Pretlav, Professor Stephen Pretlav, who is the Deputy Head of School of Architecture and the Built Environment. And he has worked in the heritage sector, particularly as a sustainability scientist. So he'll be speaking a little bit about challenges with repurposing churches specifically. And Michael Poole, who's introduced himself, is connected obliquely to the Lincoln School of Conservation, and he'll be describing some of the conservation projects that they've undertaken. And then right at the very end, Heather Hughes, who I've seen has dipped in. Professor Heather Hughes has been leading on the University of Lincoln Decolonizing Lincolnshire project. And so she's going to be adding some of the quite exciting work that's been going on, again, particularly related specifically to historic buildings. So if I can share my screen first, and hopefully I'll get this absolutely correct for a change. Okay, so I will play it from the very beginning. Okay, so I'm sort of putting this together under the sort of umbrella of aspects of heritage we may not think about. And I think the heritage industry in itself, in its various guises, and also with its various skeptics, has been very much part of the last sort of 40 or 50 years of working within historic environments and also protecting historic environments. So in order to understand what to expect in this lecture, I'm going to give a brief introduction to our contribution, and pretty much after that, without any further ado, hand over to Stephen. We will then have working with repurposing buildings practically and sustainably, and that is Stephen Pretlav. And then University of Lincoln Conservation Unit Projects Approaches and Principles, Mike Poole, and I hope, Mike, that I'm not overstepping the mark by naming that for you. The contemporary real world of heritage, which is what I will present. And then we'll finish off with Heather, who's going to be talking about uncovering the alternative Lincolnshire. So I suppose a lot of this is heritage and context. And my sort of 25 years as a heritage practitioner, largely in South Africa, but dealing largely with African heritage and the contestation of African heritage, really sort of implicates alternative lenses of heritage and heritage practice. And some of this I'll be briefly discussing with you because given the sort of significant political and social changes and economic changes in South Africa, quite a lot of leading heritage thinking is actually coming out of those sorts of contexts. And I also want to be able to say that heritage is very much transdisciplinary as well as interdisciplinary. And so I work within the realms, practically I'm an architect, my PhD is in social anthropology, but I've also got degrees in archaeology, and I publish a lot in history. And being able to move between various types of disciplines is really important. And the group that we're with today is actually indicative of that. Mike Poole is a mechanical engineer. Stephen Pretlav is a construction scientist, and Heather Hughes is an historian. And between us, we all bring quite different lenses of interpretations to particular views of context in heritage. And so I definitely hand over to Stephen Pretlav. Stephen, your slides are loaded if you need to instruct me when to move.
Okay, thank you, Debbie, and hello everyone. It's great to be involved in this. As Debbie said, I'm Stephen Pretlav. I'm the Professor of Sustainable Construction at the University of Lincoln. I'm currently the head of the School of Architecture and the Built Environment. Debbie's asked me just to present something to you, and I'm going to do a reasonably concise and precise presentation on a particular project that I was involved in a few years ago, which looked at church buildings. And in fact, we were looking at heating systems in those church buildings because the Church of England is very well aware that their building stock, as it were, is not only old and often in need of maintenance and refurbishment, but also that they are huge energy consumers, and they contribute quite significantly to carbon emissions. So let me just see if I can share my screen. I'm actually quite glad. Can someone confirm that that's on the screen? Can you see that, everyone?
Yeah.
Okay.
Speaker offer under advisement.
Okay, so this work was carried out quite a few years ago on the basis of the recognition by the Church of England that churches are huge energy consumers, and I worked together with a London architectural practice who was working in churches installing heating systems, and we wanted to get some sense of sensible strategies for looking at church buildings. At the moment, something like 2,000 churches in the UK have closed over the last decade, which is quite worrying. And those that survive often only survive because they open themselves up to much more community activity than just simple sort of worship. And the consequences of that is that the churches that we have looked at have to adapt how they're used, and they have to offer more than they would have when they were first built. They're clearly a very important part of our cultural heritage, and church buildings contain many valuable artifacts and materials which are very sensitive to the environment and yet have survived for hundreds and hundreds of years in those environments within a church that were unheated. So by providing heating into church buildings, we not only start consuming energy and contributing to carbon emissions and climate change, we're also having a detrimental effect on the fabric of the building and the artifacts and materials within those buildings. In fact, in this country, only a handful, literally 3 or 4 or 5 churches in the whole of the UK were originally designed to have heating systems when they were first built, and the vast majority of them now have heating systems, like in our housing market, but they were installed at a much later stage. So this project was really all about looking at churches and how they are heated, and coming up with a strategy for dealing with that situation. Now, I'm wondering why my slides are not going forward.
Shall I turn it over for you?
Yeah, can you? Oh,
Yeah.
are you in control? Okay, fine. Okay, so the first thing that we started doing in this project was actually to look at what the requirements are for people who occupy churches, and in order to maintain their comfort, but also to look at the environmental requirements for various materials and artifacts that you find in churches. And what this diagram shows you is a graph where on the horizontal scale you have temperature, and on the vertical scale you have humidity or moisture levels. Towards the right-hand side, upper right-hand side of that diagram, you can see a comfort range. That is the range of temperatures and humidities where people will be comfortable. Outside of that range, they'll either be too hot or too cold, or the humidity will be too high or too low. So in all buildings, in order for occupants to have thermal comfort, we need to provide environmental conditions that sit within that box. And that's between about 19 degrees Celsius and 26, and between about 40% humidity and 80. The other areas identified on that chart indicate the environmental requirements for conservation of materials, and you can see there's a much wider range of conditions that are available. But broadly speaking, the majority of them come into the second red box that I've indicated on that diagram, which is the conservation range. And the compromise that we are having to make, and what this project focused on particularly, was how to provide conditions inside churches that are comfortable, but also conditions that will maintain the integrity of the materials and the artifacts in that church. And we had an opportunity. Can you go to the next slide, please, Deb? We had the opportunity to carry out a study in 3 churches. 2 of them were in Sussex and 1 was in Kent. And those images just give a very broad sort of visual of what those churches looked like, both externally and internally, and the heating strategies that they had adopted. So when we take the top one, which was St Bartholomew's in Bobbington, the diagram on the right, so top right-hand figure, shows that that church was heated using electricity and literally electric bar fires. The church in the middle, St Peter and St Paul in Ashington in Sussex, used a radiant underfloor heating system. So it had a gas boiler with warm water, and it literally heated the floor, the mass of the floor, to provide thermal comfort. And then the church at the bottom, St Mary's in Washington, used a convective heating system, much like all of us would have in our own homes. So a gas boiler pumping water around radiators in that building, so that convective heating, in other words, warming up all of the air, was the strategy that they adopted for their heating. So we had 3 very different strategies for heating those 3 churches, and the object of this project was to try and find out how efficient those heating systems were. Next slide, please. Now, in the field of architecture and building science, we often come across this area of research referred to as Post-Occupancy Evaluation, or POE. It's essentially part of the architect's duties now, and part of their role is not only to design and see a building through construction, but when they hand that building over to whoever's going to occupy that building, they continue to evaluate and measure the performance of the building. So they measure energy consumption, energy generation, and water consumption, just to get some sense of whether the building has performed as it was designed to perform. So POE is a big area, and it's one of the key areas of my research. We don't often carry out this sort of thing in buildings that are hundreds of years old. We normally carry out post-occupancy evaluation in new buildings, new housing particularly, but nonetheless, there's a recognition that no matter what the architectural design and the construction industry, the built environment industry can offer in terms of modern sustainable buildings, there's a very wide recognition that it's our existing heritage, older buildings that are the main part of the problem, because they are not good performers on an environmental level. So we went into these churches and we measured things like energy consumption by literally taking meter readings, but we also used data loggers, and that image shows a couple of the types of data loggers that we use. These are very sophisticated little devices. The one on the left, the Hobo, is about the size of a small matchbox. The one on the right is long and thin and about the size of my index finger. These are clever little devices. They're self-contained. They have sensors that measure temperature and humidity. They have a battery inside, and they have a small integrated circuit with a data logging system. And you connect these to your laptop computer. You tell the device how often you want it to take readings. You then disconnect your cable and you leave it in the building. And these things can monitor conditions, environmental conditions in buildings literally on their own. They could be left in that building for months and months, if not years, and they simply sit there waiting for the next hour, and then each hour they wake up, take a reading, and then go back to sleep again. And so we collect considerable data about environmental conditions in buildings, and in the churches that's precisely what we did for this particular study. Next slide, please, Debbie. So one of the problems we have with churches, and there's an image of one of the churches, the church at Ashington, is that they are very large. They have very large internal volumes, and they are made of very heavy materials that have what's referred to in physics terms or science terms as having significant thermal mass. The problem with buildings like this is if you need to heat the entire interior body of air, there's a lot of it. And the heavy weight mass of the building means they take an incredibly long time to warm up, and they take an incredibly long time to cool down. And the problem that we have in most of these churches is that they do have convective heating, so we warm the air in the church, and warming such a large volume of air is very inefficient when you think that the humans that occupy that building only occupy the first 2 meters above the floor. So all the warm air rises to the top of the building, which is an incredibly inefficient way of keeping people inside that building comfortable. So the warm air rises to the top parts of the building, and that's known as thermal stratification, and that was also something that we measured as part of the project. Next slide, please, Debbie. We also had to ask the people occupying these churches to diarise the activity, because some churches are used a lot more than others. You will see that the church, this was for a 2-week period when we did the monitoring, the church on the left at Bobbing, it had a service on one day, some bell ringing, another service a week later, some bell ringing and another service. The one on the right in Washington had a number of services throughout that 2-week period. One in the middle didn't take place because the heating system stopped working. Whereas the one in the middle, Ashington, you will see that it not only has services where people would worship in that building, but it had toddler groups, it had cafe groups, it had a history group taking part of in activities. It did have worship and communion. It had men's breakfast groups. It had toddlers groups, again, a cafe. So it was a church that was used much more as a community church and for much more of a typical week. Next slide, Debbie. So we went into these churches, and the diagram shows there the 3 basic plans for those 3 churches, all approximately the same size. Sorry, let me just, it's rather sunny here in London today. And the diagram on the left shows the innovation that we had to use in order to monitor things like stratification. So what you see there is a ladder going up the wall of that church, and hanging from a piece of string which was fixed to the rafters at the top are data loggers at 4 different heights, because we wanted to monitor and measure the environmental conditions at the bottom where the people are occupying the building, but also at varying heights in that building, so that we could get some sense of which of the heating strategies caused thermal stratification to take place. Next slide, please. So this diagram shows the environmental conditions measured in the 3 churches, and again is essentially a graph which shows on the horizontal scale temperatures and on the vertical scale moisture levels or vapor pressure. And the 3 churches each have 3 little different indicators on that graph, and you can see that Ashington, the blue squares are very much towards the right-hand side of that diagram, indicating that that church, which was the one that was used most, was also the one where the heating was on the most, and you can see that the environmental conditions in that church were warmer than in the others, and the other 2 churches which weren't used as much were considerably colder, you know, on occasions going down as low as 2, 3, 4 degrees Celsius. Now that is not comfortable. If in a building in that temperature, you will often find that it's colder inside the building than it is outside, because the outside conditions change on a daily basis, but it takes so long for the interior to change in a building with such large volume and such thermal mass that it's just a cold building, and we'll see a bit more about that in a moment. The research that we do, the research that we completed in this project is one that would be referred to as quantitative research rather than qualitative, and a lot of research in architecture circles are based on a qualitative nature. My work is very much about quantities. It's about going into buildings and interrogating them. It's about measuring. It's about analysing large amounts of data, and it's about finding out things through research where there's no argument that the data that you've got is accurate and it's numerical. Next slide, please, Debbie. So we were able to look very carefully with all of this data at how the churches responded to heating patterns, and I won't go into this in too much detail, but those 3 graphs are for one particular Sunday when all 3 churches were being used for purposes of worship, and the shape of the graphs tell us a great deal about how those churches respond to the heating system. So the one at the top is Bobbing. This is one that had electric radiant heating, and what it tells you is that in the middle of the day when the church is being occupied by people, you can switch on that heating system and almost immediately you get warmth, because you're not warming the air in the building, you're radiating heat at the occupants. And although electricity is viewed as being a very poor carbon fuel to use for heating, in certain circumstances with large air volume buildings with intermittent occupancy, switching on an electric bar fire for a short period of time is very efficient. So you can see from that top graph, you switch heating on, the church increases in temperature very quickly, but when you switch the heating off, it drops again very quickly. The one in the middle is Ashington with the underfloor heating, where the heating never went below 13 degrees C. You can see that church is consistently warmer than all other three, and it's used throughout the week, more so than the other three. And because it's the thermal mass of the building that you're warming up, it takes almost half a day to warm up to occupancy temperature and then half a day to cool back down again. But it's a much nicer, warmer environment. And then the one at the bottom that uses the sort of heating system that most of us will have in our homes, you can see that it takes longer for it to heat up because you're warming up all the air in that space. And in fact, for middle of the day worship in that church, the boilers would kick in at sort of 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning in order for the church air to be warm enough for people to occupy the building for 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock service. And what you can also see is the 4 lines at the top of that graph show the thermal stratification, which indicate that all of the air you're warming up, the warm air, is actually rising to the top of the building where people, which isn't occupied by people. So it's really quite inefficient. And this is the sort of work that we need to do in order to evaluate the efficiency with which we heat buildings with intermittent occupancy, and in order to provide thermal comfort for the people who occupy them, but at the same time try and ensure that the historical fabric and artifacts in those buildings don't deteriorate. Next slide, please, Debbie. This is the last slide I'm going to show you, but it also shows that if we now take all of the data that we measured in those 3 churches and we look again at the comfort range for people, which is in blue, and the conservation range for materials and artifacts, which is in sort of red. Oh, can you go back one? What you see again in this situation is that the church, which was heated most of the time, because it was used for community activities and was therefore much warmer than all the others, was the only one of those 3 churches where you began to get anywhere near comfortable range for the people in those buildings, but also the conservation of the materials and the fabric of the building. Okay, one final slide, which is just the conclusions. I'll very briefly conclude that what we found in this work was that occupancy was absolutely critical. You can't just take into account what type of heating system you use until you know how often the building is being used. Secondly, that you can read this in both directions. 2 of the churches were cold because they were not occupied. And what I mean by reading this in 2 directions is if you don't occupy a building very much, they are going to be cold. And the building that was adapted to be used most of the time, where the heating was on most of the time, and where people got benefit from that building most of the time, was a much, much more comfortable place to be. That warm church was one that you walked into and took your coat off. The other 2 you walked into and you put your coat on, and was not a particularly nice environment. It also showed us that conditions are very variable. It showed that there were significant fluctuations in environmental conditions that also indicated that in most of the churches in this country, they are going into rack and ruin and deterioration because of that, and those conditions can be very damaging. It also showed us that using the mass of the church to be part of the heating strategy was very, very beneficial, both for the comfort of the occupants and the maintenance of the building. And finally, that the selection of appropriate heating strategy is critical. And I'll finish there, but there is considerable work to do. So thank you for that. Back over to you, Debbie. I'm running out of batteries on my laptop, so I'm going to revert to my phone now, if that's okay. But I'll continue with the
At least we made it.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got to find my cursor. And up comes Mike Poole. I'm going to unshare my screen.
And I will share my screen.
Fantastic. Let me get rid of mine.
I'm just finding my screen. Can you see my screen?
Almost. There we go.
Can you see that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Michael Poole, and I work with an organisation called Lincoln Conservation that's based in the University of Lincoln. Our I'll talk a little bit about Lincoln Conservation, and then I'll talk about one of the things that team does within the heritage environment, to give you an overview of some of its specialisms. But first, oh, it's working slightly differently. You can see the second slide, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, right. Lincoln Conservation is effectively a business within the university. It's wholly part of the university, but it looks like and acts like a business. It provides commercial services to the heritage sector right across the UK. And literally we've had projects in John O'Groats down to the Isle of Wight and from east to west, with some projects in Northern Ireland and Ireland too. Lincoln Conservation consists of 3 specialist conservators and a technician. And a lot of the work they do is providing research and advice, analysing the historic interiors of buildings. They look at the conservation and restoration aspects of decorative features within buildings. And equally, over recent years, they've been experimenting a lot more with conservation technologies to help rediscover our past, or to talk about our past and communicate about our past. So that's a little bit of background as to who Lincoln Conservation is. In terms of what Lincoln Conservation provides for the heritage sector, and by the heritage sector I mean architects, I mean construction companies, heritage agencies, or custodians and owners of some of the UK's most iconic historic buildings. And by that we mean that with all the work that's going on at the Palace of Westminster, such as Big Ben, our team have been responsible for the research on the clock face of Big Ben, so it's all been painted new colours. So the services provided by Lincoln Conservation to the heritage sector is something we call architectural paint research, where we regularly go into historic interiors where they want to change it. They want to make some changes to it, but you can't just do you can't just go in and throw any old paint into an historic room. It has to be done in a particular way. There's lots of legislation and rules about what you can and can't do. So what architects often ask us to do is to analyze its decorative history. And one of the techniques that we do that is to look and analyze all the layers of paint in a room that could have been there for 300, 400, 500 years. And we can very quickly give a decorative history of what that room looked like over a given period of time. We can also tell whether there was a fire in that room or smoke damage in that room. We can analyze it very precisely. We can analyze it down to what color it was, the formulation of the paints, and we can also analyze whether there's any nasties in that paint, because a lot of paints used to be based with lead, used to contain lead, arsenic, and some nasty metals as well, such as mercury. So we have our own laboratory where we do a lot of this analysis, and the team also gets involved in actual reinstatements of historic interiors. So this is a ceiling from a cathedral in Southall that had suffered a lot of water damage to these murals, where we've reinstated them to what they originally looked like. We do a lot of work with architectural ceramics, and this is the interior of the National Liberal Club in London, where a lot of the ceramic tiles had gone missing or had been damaged. So we remanufactured the tiles and repaired the damaged ones. We do a lot of object conservation and conservation of fine art collections, and more recently we're specialising in a lot of work with digital heritage, particularly scanning, replication and recording, and that's something I'm going to major on with my talk here afterwards. In terms of the kind of clients that Lincoln Conservation, we are a niche organisation, and we do work with some very prestigious organisations. So we work with our main heritage agencies such as Historic England, English Heritage, Historic Scotland. We work with the Palace of Westminster. We work with the Royal Household. We work with some major museums. We work with the Royal Navy's Historic Dockyard. We've worked with the BBC, the V&A, Chanel, amongst other things. So this is an organisation that's held in high regard right across the UK with the work that we do. I'm not sure why that's there. Okay, so one of the things that I was going to talk about was
Michael.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's Stephen here. I'm on my phone watching this, but the slides don't seem to be moving. Are you still on
Oh,
the
right.
first
Okay.
slide?
Yes. Right. I think it's actually, I'm just going to try something else. Sorry about this. I'm just going to share.
Mike, I can see them, which is weird.
Yes, I know. I think it's looking at the wrong screen.
Okay.
Let me just have a look at this.
I was going to say it could be me, of course.
No, it's not. I just don't want it to look at that one. That's actually the wrong presentation. I'm just trying to actually stop that presentation. Let me just find the right one. I don't know how to switch this presentation off at the moment. It's connected to a strange one. Right, let me just see if I can find this. Desktop. Right, I think I've got it now. Okay. I'm just working on this. Forgive me for a moment. Right, share. Right, can you now see my screen? I've got six images on there.
Yeah, we can see
Okay.
that, Mike. Thank you.
Perfect. So those are the services that we provide to industry. And I'm just making sure again that I can. These are the clients that we work for or have worked for. So it includes architectural companies, it includes construction companies, as well as very important historic agencies, curators and custodians of the UK's historic fabric. What I was going to talk about in particular that I think Debbie asked me to just focus on a little bit was some of our work we do with using digital technologies to help record some of this historic fabric, some of the three-dimensional scanning technologies that we use to help us in the work that we do in interpreting the historic environment. So we tend to use a range of scanners where we can scan tiny objects using handheld scanners, or we can scan much bigger objects such as Lincoln Cathedral, where we're using scanners that have got a 300-meter range. And we can also look at various accuracies. So we're very well equipped to scan objects and features, architectural features, right through to structures. We don't specialize in scanning landscapes because we specialize in the built environment rather than large landscapes that might be 1, 2, or 10 kilometers big. So that's what we don't do. One of the scanning technologies that we use that has become really quite popular is an infrared-based system, such as the kind of products that you can find from Matterport. So quite often our team has to go away to various environments across the country, to the north of Scotland, to the Isle of Man, to Northern Ireland, etc., etc. And we have to go into a building, a derelict building, where we have to sometimes wear protective clothing. It's got restricted access. So we take along an infrared scanner with us because it's very quick to quickly record a space in 3 dimensions. So we can create this accurate copy, a 3D copy, or we call them a digital twin of a space that we are going to do some research in. This is a particular tool that we use, and it means that we can then remotely freely explore this space with our clients and contractors. We can view the space from multiple angles. We can go into the space and measure it. We can interact with it. We can create hotspots. We can take high quality photos. We can create walkthroughs. And it's been a great way for us to work with architects and developers to understand that environment as it goes through the process of being redeveloped. And to give you an example, this is one building that we worked on. This is the Civil War Centre. Well, actually, this is a slightly different example. As we started to use these technologies, some of our clients were saying, well, we can use this for the purposes of visitor engagement or learning. So the National Civil War Centre, where we do a lot of work with them on the conservation of their objects within the museum, asked if we could scan their museum to create a learning environment for them. So this is the museum that we have here, and we can I can actually take you inside the museum, and we very quickly scanned it so you can walk around the museum. And within here, I'll just see if I can find something. Within here, We then trained the museum on how to add these hotspots. And these hotspots contain lots of information that's used for our history A-level curriculum. So the students have a chance to walk around the museum and listen to lectures and videos from some top historians around the country about the significance of the Civil War in the UK back in the 15th, 16th century, 15th centuries. And a lot of these hotspots are geared towards that A-level curriculum. So that's a slightly different application that we've used with it, but and it's been very interesting that we bought it for one purpose. We bought this scanning technology to support our work with reinstatements of historic environment, but it's very quickly led on to other applications that we've started to work with a number of organisations on now in other ways, such as visitor engagement and learning. So very quickly, if we go into a building, so this is Doddington Hall on the outskirts of Lincoln. It's an Elizabethan manor house, and we scanned the whole building in a day. This is the full Matterport setup that we use here. It's very quick, very easy to use, and we use a number of cameras with the software. This is the actual Matterport camera, but we also use Leica and smartphones as well. And it's it's very quick and easy to capture an environment that we can later interact with and discuss with the client if we have to. In terms of how the technology works, it's a camera that's mounted onto a tripod, and that can be the Leica camera, which is an expensive piece of kit, or it could be an iPad or an iPhone. The Matterport system itself uses infrared light to measure three-dimensional space, whereas the Leica system that we use uses a terrestrial laser scanner, so that's more accurate. And iPhones, the latest iPhones has a LiDAR capability to measure the space. That creates point cloud data for us, which we can extract from the software if we need to do that. It gives us a degree of accuracy and means that we can then put that into various 3D modeling tools, or AutoCAD, BIM, etc. And it's just very useful to create this three-dimensional doll's house. So the tool that we have here creates three-dimensional space that you can measure, and it's not 360-degree virtual photography. This is not 360-degree photography. It's measured space. So it's great for us. Within the heritage sector, we now are using it for lots of for many different applications as we've rolled this out over the last 2 years. So one, it helps us to create an accurate digital record and a copy for future development or disaster recovery. It helps with planning, research, and architectural phases of a project and the reinstatement of environments or buildings. It helps to tell a before and after story, which some of our clients like as well. It's great for estates and facilities management. It's brilliant for events and exhibitions, particularly if you've got one space where you have a temporary exhibition and then you want to move it on. If you can record a temporary exhibition, then you can create a library and a catalogue of these exhibitions, which you could put behind a paywall, or you've got a record of it for future purposes. We use it for wayfinding and training, particularly in COVID. So when somebody needs to know an environment before they visit it, we can actually take them to the virtual environment where they can make their own way around it. We've also used it for accessing the inaccessible, which I'll come to, and we've used it to help out some of our agencies locally that specialise in helping to improve tourism as well. So it's really grown beyond the original purpose that we bought this equipment for. From our scan data, it automatically can download floor plans and it will put in basic information for you. If you're scanning a bathroom, our software knows that it's a bathroom and it will call it a bathroom. So it's great from that point of view. We can also output photographic ortho elevations from the data too. So we've worked with the National Trust using this technology to help create statements of significance of a property when we're looking at their historical provenance and background. You can use it to create three-dimensional models quite easily, which we can then export and put into a BIM environment through the OBJ data that we can extract from it. So that's proved useful. And like I said, initially we were using it as virtual site visits because we work all over the country, and the architects can be based in another part of the country, the constructors are in another part of the country, and the properties in another part of the country. So it's been great to bring together and reduce lots of costs associated to that, as well as obviously what we've had with COVID. And in the environment, you can measure these environments. So it's minimized the risk, the time, the cost of site visits. So it's been great from that point of view. We've used it in one location where we had to convince the client that we could actually take this picture frame and transport it through a particular doorway. In this case, they wanted it to go through a certain door. We went, sorry, that doorway is not big enough. We've got to go through another doorway. So you can go into these spaces and measure them. I also said we could use it for providing access to the inaccessible. So for things like Lincoln Cathedral's bell tower or roof tower, people who've got a physical disability cannot always get into these spaces. Children under 14 cannot get into these spaces because the cathedral's not insured for children to go into these spaces. But we can create these virtual tours and we can populate them with hotspots that provides a degree that next level of access, that virtual access. So this is the bell chamber within Lincoln Cathedral that we provided a tour for, and we've now done that for one or two other spaces. We've used it to help facilities management, where you can create this digital copy of a space, and all the hotspots in there are geared towards the key facilities in there, such as fire extinguishers, sprinkling systems, etc., that the owner of that house needs to work with their estates people to help plan for disaster recovery, planning scheme schematics, where all the emergency points are, to help with training of staff, guiding contractors into spaces, even down to taking a contractor into a room where the hotspot says this piece is broken, the other hotspot says this is where you can buy the replacement from, and then the other hotspot said provided them with a how-to video on how to fix it. So it's been great for facilities management. We've used it to record events and temporary exhibitions. So this is at Alexandra Palace in London. There was an exhibition, there was an event going on. So we documented the space for them. And so they now have a record of that. We've got the whole space that you can then walk through, etc. So we've been doing quite a bit of work with them in this space. And hopefully I'm getting towards the end, but you can then also walk into these spaces and you can take photographs from them, of 4K quality photographs. So you can walk into a room, position a room in a particular angle, and then take photographs, which have been great for marketing, for communication, etc. One of the restrictions of infrared scanning and the Matterport system is you normally cannot do outdoor spaces unless you invest in other bits of kit. So we've done that because we've had to scan sand dune systems, we've had to scan piers. So we use the Leica system and laser-based technology to create these virtual environments. You can do scan using the Matterport system or an infrared system outdoors, as long as the sun hasn't crested the environment, because the sun very quickly just floods it with infrared light. So you can do outdoors, but it takes a bit longer to do with either system. And I think that's pretty much all I was going to talk about, Deborah. A quick overview of who Lincoln Conservation is, what they do, and one of its specialisms, one of its technologies that it's used to help with its work in the historic environment. Deborah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. I was just looking at the title and thinking, okay, we've done the innovation, we should have done the identity section first, but actually the identity section is probably a little bit more complex. So Michael, I give you full permission to turn your screen off, and it's back over to me. Thank you very, very much. That was great. I've just got to make sure I've got the right slide. Okay, so moving on. So I want to sort of just, I suppose, coming from South Africa, coming from a developing country, and sort of being really, I suppose, interested in how these things are playing out, particularly in the global north. I suppose a series of provocations, and these are provocations we all know. But actually heritage by definition deals with change, and it's not mothballed, and it's continuous, and itself is change. And much of working within the heritage environment is actually change management. And I'm sort of being able to understand the context of management of managing change or change in different places ends up really, really strongly being sort of framed by social challenges, significant social challenges, and those are largely dealing with societal differences, but significant political challenges, economic challenges, and practical challenges. And these are some of the things which have got very, very minor metrics in the global north than when you start looking in terms of working with heritage in countries abroad. So my sort of involvement in the heritage industry literally goes back to about 1997, and I worked for a while for the Provincial Heritage Agency. I was one of the people who put together the original provincial legislation, which led to the national legislation, the first national legislation on heritage in South Africa in the post-1994 era. And one of the most significant parts of that was the realization of the need to use buildings, but also the need to be able to include the intangible. And I think South Africa was the first country to actually legislate for including intangible. But certainly working on the well-accepted premise that buildings need to be used to survive is something which I, as a heritage practitioner, have taken through all of my work and all of my projects. And I suppose over the years and the sort of gradual crumbling of a lot of the built environment in South Africa due to real paradigmatic differences is something which I've actually had to come to deal with. But certainly we realize that societies in transition, and I'm putting here the slaughterhouse to fun palace, societies in transition are not often able or not often in the position to insist on appropriate change of use. And I just remember when I was working on the Built Environment Committee in Pietermaritzburg, we would have proposals coming to us for adjudication, and we'd say yes, but we'd like it to be something very similar. But actually, when you need to make a slaughterhouse into a fun palace, that's a really, really, really important thing, because the building is still being used. So the luxury of being able to keep the building within the sort of cognate area of what it was used for originally is often very challenging. But also, I think it's important to realize that the guidelines and charters which inform different places in terms of how they deal with heritage is actually also very fluid, and that all of these guidelines and charters are in a continuous reforming of ideas and frameworks. And if we think of the Venice Charter of 1964, which was incredibly materials based, and this Venice Charter was really advocated quite strongly for by ICOMOS as late as the early 2000s in terms of material conservation, and that the material was at the center of all of the conservation ideals. But then at the same time being challenged by the Global South in the late 70s, sort of fitting quite strongly into I suppose, some of the repositioning in the postmodern era or the early postmodern era, but the Borough Charter, which really advocated for quite a different way of understanding alterations and additions to building. And certainly I know that in South Africa, the Venice Charter has never, ever been appropriate. And because of its fixed requirements for the original sort of tenets of authenticity. And the Borough Charter, which is much more fluid and much more modern in its thinking, is something which we used as a framework continuously. And then also the Narrow Charter 1998, which was very firmly connected to the Venice Charter of 1964, which took on ideas of authenticity based on the material fabric. And then the Narrow Plus 20, which came out in 2014, started considering authenticity as being much more holistic than just a revisiting of a previous charter and its fixation with materiality. So my sort of specialism has sort of ended up coming into a very strange world of the in-between, and it's being able to work with societies and cultures in which intangibility and multiple interpretations are incredibly more important. And this is because certainly in the global south, or many of the countries in the global south, the clash between the previously colonized and the previous colonizers, if one wants to put it in that framework, but also the absolute diversity of different voices and different class positions which contribute to these voices, means that a lot of the time heritage practice is actually a continuous struggle. And this is a photograph I took of Dumbashawa, which is a rainmaking site north of Harare in Zimbabwe many years ago. And these sites of rainmaking have as much validity in their intangible use as products of continued life than do also this really spectacular monument to Nelson Mandela, which also allows for multiple voices and multiple translations. So being able to work within these realms of understanding that the society is the interpreter and not necessarily the heritage authority is actually really important. So I also, and I think that this particular moment was quite a watershed moment in my sort of late life understanding of the significant contestation of heritage, not only coming from South Africa, but being able to work on the African continent as a greater sort of fieldwork area, I suppose. And the sort of significant contestation that continues to exist between the authority and the micro authority, for example, and I use micro authority in terms of the land management group, really came to a head for me when I did a UNESCO World Heritage Committee inspection of a World Heritage site in Nigeria in 2015. And this site is a really, really important site of intangible heritage. So very, very similar to the Dumbashawa rock that I showed you in the last slide. And this site is really important for the Yoruba particularly because it is an ancient grove. And this ancient grove happens to sit within a city of 1 million people with absolutely no extant services. And the divide between what the global north wants many of these African sites to do compared with the value system that exists on the ground. And here is this is the National Monuments Regional Office for Oshun, which is a really big province, and for the site which employs of its own 50 people. You know, those sort of societal and value disconnects are things which bother me quite deeply and are really important, particularly if people are working in the global north, to start thinking about or start appreciating that these disconnects do exist. And I suppose another benefit or otherwise of coming from South Africa is that the decolonization debate really came up sort of very visual. Although there were sort of previous events in the States and in Australia, but the decolonization debate really came to the fore in the sort of concept of white privilege with the Rhodes Must Fall campaign event in 2015. And this was an absolute watershed moment in being able to sit on the divide of heritage and interpretations of heritage and reinterpretations of monument, and being able to resit myself or resit ourselves with respect to being able to see the many sides of a story, and being able to accept that the many sides of a story must all coexist. And this here is the statue of King George V outside Howard College, which is the sort of central building of the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban. And I think the backstory to George V being being erected as a statue outside Howard College has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that he was he was king of England at the time, but rather that he was actually a very close ally of T.B. Davis, who was one of the original sort of developers of the University of Natal as it was in the past. And King George V contributed a lot of money and goodwill to the university. So it had very little to do with a sort of a colonial link as opposed to more of a social link. But at the same time, the manner in which the statue was ironically whitened, but also what's the word, decorated, because I would not use the word defaced in this context, is actually a really, really important part of understanding that for all of us, increasingly, we are going to have to begin to allow for different layers of interpretation to come and exist within our worlds. And I'm going to finish off by talking about a project which I did with the first-year students, second-year students last year, which was very much situated digitally because that's where we all were digitally. But this project was really trying to get our students to start realizing that they've got to be able to think around corners and think dexterously in order to be able to be critical thinkers, but also be able to think about how society exists in a postmodern and a post-truth world in which we are actually living in. I mean, the invasion of Ukraine this morning is a case in point. And the task that I gave the second-year students was to be able to go onto the whiteboard. I set up a whiteboard in Teams or Collaborator, one of the systems. And I said to them, thinking about monuments, there's this massive, great big debate about a monument to Maggie Thatcher, who came from Lincoln, from Grantham in Lincolnshire. And as many of you know, Maggie Thatcher was a very significant personage in reasonably recent British history. And her legacy has lived on in a whole slew of consequences, some of which are positive, but many of which have actually had a very negative impact in deepening poverty and also sort of deepening the class system. And the project that I gave them was to be able to say, okay, so who is Maggie Thatcher? Now, most of our students come from first-time tertiary backgrounds. Many of their parents did not go to university. There's a social disconnect in terms of their background and their university experience. And there were a number of students who put stuff straight onto the blackboard or the whiteboard very immediately to be able to say this was a gut response, and I know this because my parents told me. And it was really interesting watching the Google discussion in the background go on quite actively about students doing a little bit of Wikipedia investigation, but being able to start pulling out the positive and the negative aspects of the impact of Maggie Thatcher and be able to start getting some sort of criticality themselves in being able to see behind the corners or being able to see behind the facades of the truths which they may have been given, but also be able to understand the debate about the Maggie Thatcher monument, which still, I think about 3 or 4 years later, is not resolved. And the response, the political response, the artistic response is really encapsulated in Mark Rubler's, sorry, a spelling mistake there, Mark Rubler's statue with Maggie Thatcher's head on a pike, compared with the original statue which was suggested, which is really a really formal, very standard sculpture of the previous Prime Minister. So I think that I've given you a sort of bit of the disturbance and a bit of the identity stuff. And now I'm going to hand over to Professor Heather Hughes, who has been working in the Lincoln Business School for a number of years, but she carries out quite compelling research on particularly decolonizing Lincolnshire. And Heather, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Debbie, for that. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that I do not have slides to show you. I've got some wonderful visuals about the story I'm going to tell you, but I just haven't had time to put them together. But I'm happy to share some visuals and some information with anybody who would like to hear more after this very brief presentation. It is going to be very brief. Debbie asked me to speak just for 5 minutes or so, and it really picks up this little contribution of mine does pick up from and pull together quite a lot of what you've heard already. It goes back to churches where Stephen started us, and it follows on from this concept that we need to live with different layers of interpretation of cultural heritage and the past. It's also showing quite wonderfully, I think, this particular example about how multidisciplinarity among researchers can resolve problems that we probably can't resolve just from a single perspective. So this is we've got a project based at the University of Lincoln, but it's a public history project, so anybody can come and join us. This is a wonderful thing about public history. It's anyone who wants to have a go and help out. It's a public history project called Reimagining Lincolnshire, and it's about trying to uncover neglected, overlooked, deliberately forgotten stories in Lincolnshire's past, and to see what sense that gives us of where we are now and where we're heading in the future. So a lot of this has been to do with confronting legacies of colonialism, but it's more than that, it's broader than that as well. We're looking at gender issues and so on as well. And in fact, tomorrow afternoon, we've got a special seminar on LGBTQ plus issues and the amazing things that we've uncovered from Lincolnshire's past on that theme, dating back to the 1600s, actually. So, but this particular session today is about work that we've done to reinterpret, and Debbie has used the term decolonize, a church or churches. And we were invited to do this by a local vicar who was quite keen to make his church feel more inclusive. And, you know, I think this is a big issue. If we want to use church buildings more, and Debbie's referred to this, Stephen's referred to this, if we want churches to be more used, it's not just finding more ways to use them, it's also reaching out to other people who might currently feel quite marginalized and the churches aren't that friendly places. This project also is about, interestingly, connecting the tangible to the intangible, and it's about reading the artifacts inside church buildings and outside, in fact. What we were asked to do was to go and have a look around a particular church, and I'm going to tell you which one it is, and you can look it up online. You won't find the information I'm about to tell you online anywhere, and that's, I think, part of the problem, but it's called St. Chad's, and it's in a village just outside Lincoln called Dunholm. And we were invited by the vicar to go and look around St. Chad's, and to be honest, we were quite frightened. We thought, what if we find nothing at all? What if our skills do not stretch to being able to tell stories? What if we find it impossible to decolonize a church? What would that look? How would we feel about that? Well, as it turned out, there was so much in there that made me feel that this was such a worthwhile effort to embark upon. So bearing in mind that this was a random example for us, it was a vicar who'd invited us into his church. We hadn't chosen the church. I'm going to tell you a couple of things that we found. This is a work in progress, quite literally. I mean, we've only embarked on this within the last month. So this is a work in progress, and there is so much more to explore, but I think we've gathered so much of value in terms of the methods we use as well as the results that we've achieved so far. One of the a point that I would like to make about method is that quite a lot of the wonderful information that we need to start disseminating more about our churches is that it's not in any archive. You know, there are big questions about what's been saved in archives and what's been forgotten. And this is also a very good illustration of how you have to go digging and how you have to expand your notion of what an archive really is. So one of the stories that we have found connects to something that Debbie mentioned earlier, the Roads Must Fall movement. There are two plaques in this church that both reference the former British colony of Southern Rhodesia. One is about the Matabele campaigns of the 1890s that were directed by Cecil John Rhodes himself, and they were about colonizing a particular area that became part of Southern Rhodesia, and about local people who belonged to the parish in Dunholm, who were obviously part of Rhodes's column that went in as an occupying force. So there are some stories we can tell about that campaign and about what those people were doing in Southern Rhodesia at the time. But by complete and utter chance, also in this church is a plaque to a squadron that was based nearby during the Second World War, a squadron of RAF Bomber Command, because Lincolnshire was full of stations for heavy bombers bombing Europe, which is another story altogether which we need to tell. But in terms of just pulling this back to St. Chad's, the squadron was called 44 Rhodesia Squadron because of the number of white volunteers from Rhodesia who served in the squadron. And I've done a lot of research on this squadron for another project that I'm involved in. A lot of, and this is an untold story, or it's beginning to be told, some 5,000 or 6,000 people from West Africa and the Caribbean, black people, volunteered to serve in the RAF during the Second World War. And some of them served in 44 Rhodesia Squadron. And quite by chance, I have discovered one story which I think has real resonance with our situation today and with things that have been on the news very, very recently. We know of at least one black airman who was in 44 Squadron. His name was Sergeant Gus Batty. He was probably from the Caribbean, and he was a rear gunner, a position in a bomber aircraft that was the most dangerous, the most exposed to enemy attack, and the most difficult to escape from if the plane came down. He arrived as a crew member of the Rhodesian pilot whose name was Doug Rail. Rail himself faced a lot of hostility from other Rhodesian airmen in 44 Squadron who wanted him to get rid of Batty. This is the, but it's such an interesting story because the white aircrew were also divided on issues of race, because Doug Rail stood by Batty, declaring that he was an excellent asset. And in the context of experiences of racism today, we've just had the story of Yorkshire cricket all over our television screens. I think this example is very important because it tells us that it shouldn't always be left to black colleagues, whether on a cricket squad or in an aircrew, to call out racism. White colleagues can be doing that too. So I think that there are some very, very important resonances in some of these monuments that we can bring them to life for the current parishioners, as well as making these places more inclusive, because this is my point. These plaques and things on the wall probably don't mean a lot to the people who go into these churches all the time already now. We need to bring them to life, and that's how we connect tangible and intangible heritage, by telling stories about the things in these churches. But our most wonderful find, and I'm going to just slip this in, our most wonderful find was made after we'd visited the church. The vicar sent us a copy of an old church guide. I'm sure that if you visited parish churches, you'll be familiar with the little kind of photocopied 4 or 5 page guide that somebody long ago put together and hasn't been changed for years and years and years, and you put 5p in a box and you can have a copy. So he sent us a copy of a guide to St. Chad's that had been produced, I think, in the 1960s. And it tells us, this story tells us about how important local knowledge. The man, I think his name was Terence Leask, he was a parishioner. He's long gone, but his little guide lives on, and it gave us a clue to something utterly fascinating, this local knowledge, because we haven't found it in any archive. We are wondering whether it's going to be in any archive. That the altar screen in this church was carved by somebody who was called Muhammad Thomas Phillips. And of course, the name just kind of popped out of the page, off the page for us. And we have begun to do research. You can almost find nothing about him online, but there was just enough to get us going. He was born, Muhammad Thomas Phillips, at the mouth of the Congo River in the late 1870s. His father was witness to the so-called scramble for Africa. Muhammad Thomas was born of a British father, his name was Richard Cobden Phillips, and an African mother called Nene Bassa. We are beginning to find out more. She was from a very distinguished local family in the area which is now Cabinda of Central West Africa. And at a very young age, the father brought his three children back to Britain, we think possibly because of the death of the mother, maybe, but he brought them back. And Muhammad Phillips studied at the York School of Art, and he went on to be head sculptor of a very well-known heritage conservation company, and Mike might be interested in this, in Stamford, called Bowman and Sons. Okay. And there's a class issue here as well, because we have discovered not only that Muhammad was the most amazing sculptor, and his work is in lots of places, in lots of parish churches, in lots of First World War monuments, because he died in the early 1940s. His work is in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle too. And we are struggling now to try to put together a record of all the work that he completed. But there's a class issue here as well, which is that often the designers of monuments and plaques and other artifacts of a religious or war memorial nature are mentioned, but not the very accomplished sculptors who actually produced them. So we think that there is more than just a race issue here, a forgettery. We think that there's a class issue, and we think that some of these sculptors really ought to be far better known. So we've opened a whole new seam of research for ourselves, and we're happy to keep you updated if you'd like to hear more, but that's just a work in progress and a little report on the kinds of things we're doing. We think that this can be extremely exciting for everybody, this notion of decolonizing a church. These are wonderful stories to rescue and to share with a very wide range of people today. Thank you.
Thank you, kind people. And there, as they say, Ian, endeth our story. I think I was a bit concerned that we wouldn't have enough material to fill the 45 minutes, but evidently I think we've done pretty well on that.
Yes, I think you have. Yes, that's been absolutely fantastic, Deborah.
Are there any comments, any questions?
Certainly, whilst people are thinking about it, certainly I took quite a bit away from all the presentations. Particularly interested in Stephen's presentation with regards to the fact that we've got a number of buildings on site at the school that date back a number of years. We've got one building that dates back to 1719, and then 3 or 4 further buildings that are circa 1840. And certainly the 1840 buildings are very church-like in appearance, with high vaulted ceilings, timber ceilings, and the heating of them has provided us with an ongoing nightmare for a number of years. So I was particularly interested in that piece. and despite working down here near Spalding, I actually live in Lincoln, so was very interested as well with the information regarding Dunholm and Doddington Hall through Michael's presentation. So for me personally, there's some real highlights there.
Oh, fantastic! Well, I'm glad that we landed on some sort of sympathetic ears somewhere, because it actually was, I suppose, identity and innovation does cover a very broad section. So, you know, hopefully we managed to give you a flavour of some of the stuff that we're actually doing.
Absolutely, perfect. Any questions from anybody else? Antonella?
Yes, it's more a comment than a question. I guess that the whole idea of giving a new life to historical buildings, connecting physical with the digital space, opens a lot of new opportunities to connect not only digital and physical, but also different players in the society. People who work on preservation, cultural managers, but all educators, because this is the subject today, but also the economic sphere, because there are a lot of possibilities for tourism development, enterprises that are dealing with the new technologies. So I think that if the preservation of historical buildings is able to trigger these connections, then there is a new life for these activities that, however, risk to remain in a limited space of specialists of that area. So I guess that looking in this direction can open new perspectives.
Absolutely, and I think for me, what's so useful, I mean, you know, although the actual material and the connotation in South Africa, for example, of much of the colonial built heritage is so negative, what it can do is it can also allow for multiple translations. And if you think that South Africa's got 11 official languages, it can be translated visually, but also digitally, you know, so you can actually allow for multiple plural interpretations. Whereas if you try and translate from something on a display board from English into Zulu, the Zulu takes up about 3 or 4 times the amount of text that the English does because of the way that the language works. So the actual practical thing of some of these translations is really difficult. So it is actually really useful in the whole decolonization debate as well, allowing for broadened access, whether it's people who are differently abled or with very different lenses on the world. Absolutely, that's a really, really interesting comment. There we go, Mike. We've got another connection. Thanks for putting out that connection for us, Francesca.
Perfect, thanks.
Is there anything else? Yeah, it sounds like that's us done.
It does, doesn't it? Yes, I think
Yeah.
we've been going for nearly 3 hours now, so I think everybody's ready for probably a cup of tea and something to eat.
Remember, academics are used to talking. Well, thanks very much that you've given us the opportunity to at least let you know what we're doing, if that's a sort of one way of actually translating what we're doing to you. So, and what's going on in Lincolnshire, really.
It's been absolutely fantastic. It really has.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I suppose.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, Em. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks.
Thank you.